So in this video, we're going to talk about David Edgar's play Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is, of course, an adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, in my opinion, should originally have been a play and not a novel. So Edgar does some really interesting things with this, and actually one of the interesting things involves the performance history of this particular play, because when the final version of the play was put on at Birmingham Repertory Theatre in June of 1996, both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were played by David Schofield, but in the original version, or the earlier version, titled, with the full title, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when that was first staged at the Royal Shakespeare Company's Barbican Theatre in London in 1991, Henry Jekyll was played by Roger Allam and Mr. Hyde by Simon Russell Beale. So that's an interesting shift. And Edgar explains in the introduction why they made that shift. In one crucial respect, however, my adaptation departed from tradition by separating out the two central characters. In the RSC production of my first version, Roger Allam and Simon Russell Beale brought huge intellect and attack to playing the two sides of a single personality. But in addition to denying the audience the pleasure of seeing one man turn himself into another before their very eyes, we discovered that the theater's remorseless corporeality prevented the audience from making the essential leap of belief. Try as we might to convince them that they were seeing a battle inside a single soul, what was actually in front of them were two men in Victorian clothes having an argument in a laboratory. Accordingly, when Bill Alexander invited me to rework the play for the Birmingham Repertory Theatre, I decided to revert to the more traditional model. It was no surprise to either of us when David Schofield rose magnificently to the challenge. So what's interesting about that is that the audience needed to see the transformation from Jekyll to Hyde and from Hyde back to Jekyll. And that's what theater does. That's what the novel doesn't do. We can imagine it, we can visualize it when we're reading Stevenson's novel, and it's a fantastic novel, by the way. It's an amazing novel. But it's not the same as seeing the transformation ourselves. And so that's one of the things that's interesting about this particular play with its distinct production history, is that visual component. But it's also worth noting that this is fundamentally what actors do. And so, while audiences want to see the transformation between Jekyll and Hyde, they want to see one person transform themselves from Jekyll to Hyde and Hyde to Jekyll. What's kind of elided in that transformation is the transformation that the actor has already made even before stepping on stage, where that actor becomes Henry Jekyll. And so Edgar, in that introductory bit, talked about audiences not being able to willingly suspend their disbelief, not being able to imagine that these two actors are the competing sides of one person's personality. But the audience has willingly suspended their disbelief that David Schofield is not Henry Jekyll or Roger Allam or whoever it is. So that idea of transforming oneself to play a role is always inherent in the theater, or at least in sort of traditional theater, in like Brechtian theater and post-dramatic theater and things like this. It's a different story. But in traditional theaters, and this is indeed a very traditional play in most senses, we have that willing suspension of disbelief already. But it only extends so far, apparently. It doesn't extend to seeing two actors as competing halves of one personality. So that's really, really interesting, and that tells us a lot about theater and psychology, but it also tells us about the nature of the dynamic personality of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as we experience it. And again, that's a big part of the reason why I say Stevenson's novel should have been a play initially, because you already have that element of transformation whenever an actor steps on the stage. We also get, in Edgar's version, some substantial meta-theatrical components. He creates a whole sort of alternative space in the country house of Catherine Urlub, I think is. I forget. I think Urlub is her last name. It's not that crucial necessarily, but it's bothering me. Urquhart. So Catherine Urquhart, who is Henry Jekyll's sister. There are several scenes that occur in her country house with her children. She has inherited most of the stuff, pretty much all of their father's possessions. We get a clear sense that there was a strained relationship between Jekyll and his father. But, that's all there. So there's this additional storyline that's not in Stevenson's novel, but the other thing that I find really, really striking is we have the first introduction we get to the country house. We move from Act 1, Scene 1, where Enfield and Utterson, who are both characters in Stevenson's novel, and they sort of set up the frame device of Enfield telling Utterson, hey, here's this crazy story about this time I saw a dude beat a small beggar child for no reason. We go directly from that and start getting it sort of performed in the background. We transition directly into Scene 2, where Charles and Lucy, who are Catherine's children. Charles is 13, Lucy is younger. They are rehearsing a play, and so we have this great transition from Enfield and Utterson talking, Enfield sort of recounting this story that we begin to see played out of a man attacking basically like, she's selling matches and stuff like this. A man attacking this street urchin for no reason. We transition directly into that man and street urchin becoming the central figures of Act 1, Scene 2. And what we find out is, according to the stage directions here, now we pick up the situation. We are in the drawing room of a country house toward the end of a late summer afternoon. The central alcove has been turned into a little theatrical booth hung with curtains. To the side, partly concealed by the arch of the alcove, a maid stands on a chair with an oil lamp, masked to throw light on the waif, whose real name is Lucy. Her 13-year-old brother Charles plays the small man, in cloak, top hat, and false mustache. Top hat? All of them too big for him. The now descending maid is 16-year-old Annie, and the rehearsal was being watched by Charles's mother Catherine, who's in her early middle age. The curtains that Charles has pulled back to expose French windows, we see that the room is untidy, full of toys, and contains a piano, a portrait photograph of two children, Charles and Lucy, and a painting of a fierce Scottish gentleman against a landscape background. The intruder is Catherine's older brother, Henry Jekyll. So the children had been rehearsing a play to put on for Henry Jekyll, who's visiting the country house for the first time in a long time. And the plot of this Penny Dreadful style play that they were putting on is that an unknown man attacks a child, a flower seller, match seller, whatever it is, attacks this street urchin for no apparent reason, and murders her. Literally one of the things that Henry Jekyll, or that Edward Hyde does. Literally one of the crimes that Edward Hyde commits. The children are staging in their play prior to Jekyll, who in this case takes his father's books, because his father had been this sort of occultist, maybe, but like not occultist in the sense of like putting on weird cloaks and doing like rituals and things like this, but in the sense of like pseudoscience. So an interest in mesmerism or hypnotism, interests in astral projection, and all these things that were these sort of semi-scientific, semi-spiritual kind of pursuits that the Victorians were fascinated by. So Jekyll's father had apparently come up with the potion to separate the two halves of the human psyche, and Jekyll himself ends up putting this into action, only to later enact the very crime that Charles and Lucy's play was meant to depict for his entertainment. So again, it's definitely a play that gestures to itself as a piece of theater, as performance. And it reminds us of these sort of open questions about the actor transforming not just between Jekyll and Hyde, but also into Jekyll initially.